So I'm a family physician, and a little more than 30 years ago I became interested in evolutionary nutrition. And of course, one of the basic questions is, could it really be true that our most common diseases are absent in traditional populations? So that's basically my talk today. Most of what I say is in a book that was published in 2010, and that's available in PDF format. So I read this paper in 1985 by Boyd Eaton and Melvin Connor about evolutionary aspects of nutrition, Paleolithic nutrition. And one of the interesting statements was that traditional hunter-gatherers do not have Western disease. So I thought that was interesting. So let's see if this will work too. So I read some of the literature. There was not very much, but I got even more hooked by, for example, a study in the Kalahari Bushmen, where Stuart Truswell in the 1960s interviewed hunter-gatherers in Botswana, and they were totally unaware of spontaneous sudden death. And there were a number of studies suggesting that what we consider normal levels of blood pressure or insulin response in the oral glucose tolerance test or serum cholesterol and BMI are certainly not normal, even if you adjust for age. So I went to the Trobriand Islands. I did this survey. They are not hunter-gatherers. For various reasons, we were not able to find a proper population where we could find many elderly, because this was one crucial element for us. The Trobriand Islands, it's part of Papua New Guinea, north of Australia, in the Melanesian part of the Pacific Ocean. And this is Kitava, the island where we did the survey. It's a tropical island, 4 times 7 kilometers. At that time, there were 2,300 inhabitants, but they knew very well about their fellow Trobriand Islanders in the whole of the Trobriand Islands, what diseases they had and so forth. So 25,000 inhabitants, plus they knew several generations back. They didn't have well, they were not occupied with books and computers and stuff, so they had ample time to tell stories about their ancestors. Their diet was based on very starchy foods like yam, sweet potato, taro, tapioca. On top of that, a lot of fruit. So their carbohydrate intake is higher than the recommendations in Western countries, and certainly higher than the average for Western populations. But I think the main issue is that 75% of the calories in Western countries come from grains, dairy, refined fat and sugar, and those are totally absent in that population, and were absent in Africa during human evolution, and so on. Their level of physical activity is higher than the average for Westerners, but not exceedingly high. So if you look at a construction worker in Europe, you have, I think, something similar. But if you look at them at retirement with regard to blood pressure, atherosclerosis, etc., they are very different. Well, we don't have data for atherosclerosis. I'll come back to that at the end. There are very few studies and there is no study in hunter-gatherers, you might say, except for the Aleutian Islands, five mummified Aleutian hunter-gatherers. But I'll mention that later. But it was striking that when we made systematic interviews, they had never heard of sudden death. They had never heard of exertion-related chest pain. And we took ECGs, which together with other studies with electrocardiography confirms that myocardial infarction is rare or absent. And there are two physicians who have worked in the Trobriand Islands, Horst Jüptner to the left and Wolf Schiefenhöfel to the right. And especially Jüptner, he was working in the 60s and the early 70s for 5 years as a primary healthcare physician for these, at that time, 12,000 inhabitants. And he made systematic examinations, and he knew from back home in Germany, where he did his training, that well, he knew about stroke and cardiovascular disease, and he never saw it during those 5 years. And Wolf Schiefenhöfel has seen a couple of thousand patients, and he's a physician as well, and he works as you could say anthropologist or human ethologist, and they confirm these findings that our myocardial infarction is absent. And this is consistent with studies in other parts of Melanesia, many hospital-based clinical studies and autopsy studies where you do histologic examinations. So there is a lot of evidence from Melanesia, and the same from Africa. A lot of British doctors in the 1960s and 70s who found that our most common diseases are absent. In Uganda and Kenya, which became British protectorates in 1920, they found that for example, one series of 1,427 men older than 40 years, there was only one case of histologic signs of myocardial infarction. And among this group of 1,400, they took roughly 500 and age matched them for deceased individuals in the United States. So this is the one individual with myocardial infarction in Uganda. And you see, it's not because of lack of elderly that this kind of disease is absent. And other parts of the world, it's been found the same in these old studies. And then stroke. You don't talk as much about stroke in this when you think about ancestral diets, but and for example, the Japanese have had a lot of stroke, actually more than in the United States. So Japanese migrants, when they went to the United States, they got less stroke but more myocardial infarction. And the Mediterranean lifestyle apparently does not protect from stroke, so there is good reason to go one step further beyond the Mediterranean diet, which is a step in the right direction, I think. So we asked them, have you ever heard of a person who is suddenly unable to speak, although they are awake? No. Or who is half paralyzed, they cannot move half their body, and they had never heard of anything like that, except they heard from people in the island. I'll come back to that because it's coming now since 1975 in Papua New Guinea. So they had their first case of stroke in 1975. I will not go through all the details. When you actually read the literature, you become convinced. So it shouldn't be, and there should not be any argument about this, that these kind of diseases are fully preventable, or, well, at least you could say more or less preventable. So there is this series of 269 consecutive patients in Kampala, Uganda. All of them had an acute neurologic disease at the medical clinic in Kampala, but not a single case of ischemic stroke. There were some cases of infectious strokes. So some infections can lead secondary to stroke, but not what we mean with stroke. So as I said, the first case of stroke in 1975 in Papua New Guinea. And then we talk about risk factors, and one of them is diabetes, or even pre-diabetes. Blood glucose is, as you probably know, one of those risk factors where a normal level means a normal risk of diseases that are normal in Western countries, but that are absent in some other populations. And then a low level means a relatively low risk. But that low risk is very much higher than among non-Western populations. And there is this famous quote by Jeffrey Rose regarding, now I forgot, it's funny to say I'm going to give you a quote and then you don't remember it, but one thing is if you have a population and within that population you grade people according to their risk. And another thing is how high risk does that population have as a whole. Fasting glucose is roughly 2 standard deviations below the Swedish means. So very few reach the level of pre-diabetes. And fasting serum insulin decreases with age, and there is some overlap more than for glucose. Body weight is very low, so the Kitavans are the black ones, and this is a random population of Swedish women, and here are males. If Swedish men would, by the age of 50, have the BMI of the Kitavans, they would weigh 19 kilos more than they do, and for women 22 kilos. And then if you adjust for fat percentage, it's even bigger difference. So you tend to lose muscle mass and with age, and water content goes down. That's sort of the normal biology, but but what we see in the Western world is obviously not biologically normal. And this is waist circumference. This 14-year-old girl had the highest BMI, and it would be nice to go back and try to find her and see if, because she is kind of overweight. So at that age, all the hormones have an effect on you. And she had the same kind of diet as the rest. I forgot to mention that on average, each family spent 50 US cents per year for imported Western food. Hypertension is absent, and it's particularly marked for diastolic blood pressure, which is much lower in the Kitavans, and it does not increase with age. While systolic blood pressure actually does increase slightly after age 50, but still, even among the elderly, they have much lower blood pressure than in Western countries. Bushmen in Kalahari, Southern Africa, Yanomamo, also hunter-gatherers, the Xingu hunter-gatherers, also in South America, they have even lower blood pressure than the Kitavans. It's a bit hard to strictly compare these figures because of different ways to measure blood pressure. The Kitavans and the Swedes were examined in identical ways. They were sitting and with the arm parallel to the sternum. Then you have a certain hydrostatic pressure, and sometimes you raise. Maybe you have them sitting. I'm not sure these days how you do it in the UK. Maybe sometimes you have the patient sitting like that, and often you say the stethoscope should be at a heart level, and then it decreases, especially diastolic blood pressure goes down. So, but you can compare these two populations, and you see that they are considerably lower, especially for diastolic blood pressure. And this figure kind of summarizes all of it. So this is how many standard deviations below, or in that case above, the Swedish average are the Kitavans. So BMI for both sexes, 2 standard deviations below the Swedes. Diastolic blood pressure, also very low. Leptin, the satiety hormone that Tommy Jönsson will talk about later, is very low. But some of these markers are not dramatically beneficial. For instance, triglycerides, which is actually slightly higher, especially among the females. And the ApoB, ApoA1 ratio, which is, well, not better here than in Sweden. Now, these marked differences are found despite that there are quite a number of elderly, 6% older than 60 years. The oldest one was 95. Well, actually, this man is 100, but he was not alive when I made the actual survey. Our age estimates were based on historic events. In 12, Cyril Barnevelt Cameron came to the island and stayed there until his death. He is buried in the island. He died in 1966. In 1941, this is a Japanese sea wreck from the Second World War. So we could ask adults, how old were you when this happened? Well, I was like this boy. No, you were not, said someone, because I was not born then. And so we think we could come close to their actual ages, because they don't count their ages themselves. And it should not be surprising that there are elderly. I mean, among the Ache hunter-gatherers in Paraguay, in South America, there are not many elderlies, but there are enough of them to draw conclusions with regard to age-related disorders. The average age remaining years alive at birth is very low, and then after, if you survive the first year, it's, well, in our perspective, it's low. On average, 45 or a little more than 45 years. But then when you make it up to, let's say, 60, you have a pretty good chance of having a number of years still to live. The modal age at death, meaning the most common age at death in the United States is, or was in 2002, 85. For hunter-gatherers, the most typical age at death, or the most common age at death, when you exclude deaths before 15 years of age, is 72. So it's a myth that that this line breaks here and there are no survivors after 40. It's just one of those things that since we are so fond of what we're eating today, we don't want to hear, no, don't tell me anything more about that story, because I don't want to hear it. It's like the bone reflex in a dog, I think. Don't touch my bone. I think we can skip the other figures because there are enough survivors to say that you should look on these data. And there are no indications of genetic resistance. This is a Trobriand Islander who grew up in Kitava, and then he left for the mainland, Port Moresby, the capital of Papua New Guinea, and now he was working as a businessman and had been working for 15 years, and he had the largest waist circumference. He had the highest blood pressure. He had the highest plasminogen activator inhibitor level as well. And this is what you see in the capital. So this is from Port Moresby. And now westernization hits hard. So history repeats itself. This 47-year-old man has had a stroke. And this was seen in Africa and very thoroughly described in a series of studies. So in 1942, as I said, none of 269 cases of acute neurologic disease was stroke. And then with time, it became the most common neurologic disease in Uganda. Parallel to a change in lifestyle. And it's a tragedy and a scandal that the precise nature of the lifestyle changes among the natives during those periods have not been published. Some of my data I've collected by talking to physicians working there, and some of them say, why do you spend the time stating that these diseases are absent? We know they are not there, but well, please tell the world. Blood pressure in migrants in green at the time of migration from, this is an African population who became urbanized, and some of them stayed in the original habitat, while the green ones are the urbanized. So you see the distribution curve shifts to the right. Everyone, after some time, has a higher blood pressure than they had in their original habitat. And then when you talk about natural selection and evolution, of course, natural selection means elimination. So these dead ends are the ones who could not make it, and we are the ones who are still here. And then you should consider that our common ancestors lived about 200,000 years ago. And then we spread, well, we started maybe 100,000 years ago to spread across the globe. And then long after we left our original habitat, we started eating grains and dairy. And then if someone claims that we are adapted to these new foods, the first question is, who are we? Well, he probably means his own ethnic group. And then if he thinks we are adapted, then another question is, okay, what about those who just started eating the new food? And the interesting thing is that they get the same diseases. We all get the metabolic syndrome, abdominal obesity, cardiovascular disease, and so on and so on. So we all are, in a sense, we are all the same, more or less. There are some differences, and I would be glad to talk for an hour about the slight differences in vulnerability. I think Caucasians, Europeans are slightly less vulnerable than most other populations, but that's not my main message today, so I'll leave that for now. There are enough smokers to consider that smoking alone may not be enough to cause cardiovascular disease. And that, you can see that in other studies as well, that maybe smoking comes on top of the rest. Energy expenditure is high, but not extreme. They have a high intake of saturated fat from coconut. Actually, how many know who Gary Taubes is? He phoned me when he was writing his book that was to become a bestseller, because he had heard about the Trobriand Islanders eating a lot of coconut. His book is, well, actually, I think he is the single most important person for the present low-carb trend. He's a medical journalist in the United States. He wrote in Science in 2001. He wrote in the New York Times, and he's a good writer, and he thoroughly criticized the low-fat hypothesis. But then he's one of those claiming that carbs are bad. So he phoned me, and he heard about the saturated fat, but then he also heard about their very, very high carbohydrate intake, so he dropped it, and he doesn't mention the Kitavans in his book. Maybe he just forgot. I mean, that's the way we humans are. We buy this car, and then we see, oh, I should have bought that one. No, I forget that. Well, starch has not been shown to cause glucose intolerance or beta cell failure. Once you are glucose intolerant, by definition, you have a problem with carbs. So every time you eat a meal, after that meal, you will have a higher blood glucose. But that's not the same as what actually causes the disease. And humans have a high capacity to digest starch, suggesting that we are well adapted to a high starch diet. We have a rather high activity of salivary amylase compared to other animals. So there are high carb and low carb, high carb traditional populations, but what I think is more important that they have in common is that the foods that provide most of our energy are absent in those populations. They have constant food in surplus. I don't believe in the thrifty genotype hypothesis in the sense that we as a species must have restriction of food in order not to become overweight. The Kitavans never have lack of food. 63 years before we were there was a period of food shortage, but other than that, none whatsoever. Yes. So when I have a patient, a Westerner, I used to see it this way. You have various degrees of risk, and quite often you show it in this way instead. So the differences seem to be larger than they actually are. So this doctor says your blood pressure is normal. End of story. Goodbye. Well, maybe he adds your risk is normal. But this patient is a modern patient, and he has read some blogs, and he asks himself, who wants to be normal? That was actually the title of a commentary I gave in the European Heart Journal to the fact that if you measure blood pressure and blood lipids in a random Norwegian population, you find that most of them, after my age, would need medication. Then, of course, some people opposed to this whole medicalization, and well, I'm one of them, sort of. But I mean, if the medicines help, they help. So normal Western aging, as you know, would look something like this. Not only for John Harvey Kellogg, who you see on these pictures, but for, well, most people. And then we have accumulation of fat in various tissues, and one of the worst organs, of course, is the arteries. So atherosclerosis, it's quite disturbing that it's a normal Western disease. Up to age 40, you see that in this series, the oldest deceased person, these are autopsy studies, was 39. you have increasing degree of atherosclerosis. So it's a kind of normal phenomenon. And this 37-year-old female, she has a normal coronary arteriography, but when they put an ultrasound device into her coronary artery, they see that the inner diameter is preserved, but here there is atherosclerosis, so there is compensatory enlargement. So blood flows as it should, but there is this area of atherosclerosis, and it's not seldom that the first sign of atherosclerosis is death. The correlation between degree of atherosclerosis and degree of obesity is not as strong as you might think. So, I mean, even lean people have atherosclerosis. And it's the same in other ethnic groups. There are not many studies that are interesting in our evolutionary perspective. But there is one from 4 different populations in the 1950s. And one of these populations were deceased persons, all were 45 to 55-year-old men. So on this axis you see how many % of the left coronary artery, descending coronary artery, is affected by atherosclerosis. And in Durban, in South Africa, it was quite a lot of them had no or virtually no atherosclerosis, while that was seen in very few of the middle-aged men in New Orleans in US. Today, blacks in America or anywhere have at least as much, actually more atherosclerosis than whites. So it's not from genetic reasons. Full-blown atherosclerosis with atheromas, plaques, you don't see it in free-ranging mammals in their original habitats. Not even in elephants. They are famous because you often refer to them, that they get atherosclerosis, but actually it was relevant only for elephants in disturbed habitats, with enclosed areas, and they were also fed with hay. But in the free-ranging elephants, they did not have full. There is some degree of atherosclerosis. That might be normal biology, but not as much as we see in many elderly in the Western world. And in animal experiments, you see that diet is, I would say, the sine qua non, a necessary condition to manipulate diet. And then the researchers may be interested in tobacco smoking. So they have one group exposed to tobacco, and they see some differences. And they just briefly mention that all of them got the wrong diet, so to say. And casein is interesting because this comes back again and again and again and again as the main protein in the chew that they feed these animals with. And there has not been a proper systematic review, nor is there enough awareness among scientists that they should not regard casein as a neutral protein, as a reference protein. They should choose some kind of protein that is eaten by this animal in its original habitat. I mean, no animal keeps eating casein after weaning, of course. And then it's interesting that casein in many animal experiments, when compared most often to soy, shows more atherosclerosis compared to soy. But in one study, sorry, what did I say? Less than compared to soy, but more compared to meat protein in one study in hamsters. Well, I will not talk so much about nutrition. We will come back to that during the day. But these are rather famous, these 5 Aleutian hunter-gatherers, quite far north, mummified hunter-gatherers with an estimated age at death of 29 on average, who had some degree of atherosclerosis by CT scanning, computerized tomography. Well, it's hard to draw firm conclusions from it, but we should certainly not dismiss the idea that atherosclerotic serious disease is avoidable. Yeah, 3 minutes. Okay, I'll skip the Maasai. They have some dairy. They have a fairly thick intima media, but no raised plaques. Okay, so evolutionary theory is fundamental to biology. Westernization changes everything, and normal is not the same as optimal. Thank you.
One aspect of Western society is an increasingly aging population, and with that there is an increase in dementia. And I wondered if you were able to identify any differences in neurocognitive capacity or neurodegeneration in your Kittanans.
It's very soft data, but they are not aware of elderly people with cognitive dysfunction. There were a couple of demented young persons, and I met one of them with Down syndrome, but apparently not any dementia. So in the scientific sense, it's difficult to publish, but it's very striking when you ask them, and they are very well aware. They showed us how well they know about diseases among this population. So, for example, we asked about cancer, and there was a case of a person in that village. Everyone across the island knew the name and when, and I think what part of the body, and probably an infection that turned into skin cancer in the end. So that showed that they were very good at giving us the data. So I trust them when they and the young people said, "Why do you ask me? You have already asked the old ones. How could I know if they haven't heard of it?" So I trust them. So between you and me, dementia is not there at all.
And a follow-up, do you think that's because they ate all that seafood?
Well, I don't know.
I noticed you had fish as
Yeah.
one of their...
I mean, the Hadza do very well quite far from the sea. There are many hunter-gatherers that appear to thrive very well on the savanna or in the
Say your Kitabans.
Well, the Kitavans have a higher omega-3 intake than the Hadza, but it's hard for me to comment on omega-3. I don't have much knowledge.
We're talking about an island population. They're going to be eating a lot of fish. But may I just comment on? I worked in Uganda between 1960 and 65, and everything you say is 100% right. They did not have coronary artery disease. They had endomyocardial fibrosis, which is very, very rare in Europe, quite different. Totally different disease pattern. They did not have breast cancer, colon cancer either. We had, Jack Davis and other people published papers saying that none of these things were there, and everybody said, oh, you're a bunch of sort of colonials. But he got the National Institute of Health in America to send out a team to develop a cancer registry in Kampala to look into this question about the difference in cancer. And they couldn't find any. It was extraordinary. And out of that, interesting enough, came Burkitt's lymphoma, which was the first demonstration of a viral cause of cancer. So what you're saying is absolutely 100% right. Even in Uganda, you could drive 100 miles and you got a different disease pattern because they were eating different foods and things like that. Quite extraordinary. Really, thank you so much for that.
Okay, so we'll take a 15-minute break. You can come down and ask Staffan questions, and then we'll be back at 5